You are listening to Talking Star Wars.
Hello, Star Wars fans. I'm Alex,
And I'm Connor,
and today we're going to talk about Star Wars.
as we normally do.
Our topic for today is one that is fairly central and increasingly important in Star Wars as time has gone on, and that is the subject of cloning.
There's an entire show called The Clone Wars, and it was one of those early little nuggets that a little piece of world building in A New Hope, where Luke was so surprised that Obi-Wan Kenobi had served with Anakin Skywalker in the Clone Wars, and for decades, what is cloning? What sort of part does this kind of real world science nightmare play in Star Wars?
So cloning, as anyone listening should be aware, is the practice of taking genetic material from a donor and making copies of them, sometimes with tweaks, additions, and alterations to their genetic code.
It's generally a morally touchy subject because it is not done. You hear about cloned animals. I've seen services that allow for your pet to be cloned, and I find that to be frankly odd because it's not a naturally born individual, but something made through artificial means. So it has a strange connotation to it already.
Yeah, sort of an edgy science topic, which is why I think it was just included in a throwaway line in the late 70s when Star Wars came out. But then expanded on in the prequel trilogy, we learned that in the Clone Wars, the clones were actually on the side of the Republic. So we didn't fight against the clones fought for us against the battle droids of the Confederacy of Independent Systems.
And it's one of those elements, if you listen to our episode on Qui-Gon Jinn, released a couple of weeks ago, George Lucas was full of these kind of narrative surprises. He builds up this character of Qui-Gon Jinn as the perfect mentor, only to have him be struck down. He plants the seed of Clone Wars, and he probably didn't know what a clone was back in the late 70s, but he's developed it into a pretty interesting backstory. So we have this individual known as Jango Fett, who dresses in the fashion of a Mandalorian. He is a Mandalorian foundling, and George Lucas uses that as the template for every single clone whose visage, whose visual appearance will later be developed into the Stormtroopers.
As portrayed by Tamura Morrison. So the primary appearance of clones in, at least through the original trilogy and prequel trilogy, is from the clone army that served in the Grand Army of the Republic, based off of the template of Jango Fett. The films themselves treat the clones as fairly interchangeable. They are the extensions and tools of Palpatine, and they fairly, without question, obey Order 66 and kill all the Jedi at the conclusion of Revenge of the Sith. As the Clone Wars TV show expands upon, however, while being all templates of the same individual and having been genetically all engineered for adaptability, obedience, and quick learning and advanced aging, the clones are also individuals. They have their own personalities, preferences, and their creators, the Kaminoans, are even surprised at how individualized the clones become.
Who knows if this is just a natural side effect of cloning, or if this is in part due to Jango Fett's specific genetics, but the clones viewed themselves more as brothers rather than just duplicates, copies.
They don't view themselves as copies. They call themselves brothers. They have a military-style camaraderie with each other, and even like a brotherly, fraternal camaraderie as well. And it's interesting because the intention by Darth Sidious, aka Palpatine, was to have two infinitely scalable armies that he could continue to escalate or de-escalate the war between the Confederacy of Independent Systems and the Republic as needed, with expendable forces, then allow him to seize power. And that worked really well. What I don't think he was expecting was the individual, personalities and natures of the clones. And this is definitely coming in on the nature versus nurture argument as far as how people's personalities and worldviews are formed.
It's to the point in terms of individuality where the clones have their own names. They decorate their armor. They decorate themselves with different hairstyles, tattoos, other facial adornments. And there's even some dissension and conflict within the clones.
And we know that not all clones are the same. There are, as we see in the Bad Batch, there are clones that have certain mutations that make them give them different abilities and also make them physically distinct from other clones. This also exacerbates their personality differences. You have a clone in Boba Fett who is certainly not just a copy of Jango Fett and has his own goals, beliefs, motivations, raised partially by Aurra Sing, put out on his own, was serving Jabba the Hutt for many years, so he has a very different outlook than any of the clones raised in the Grand Army of the Republic, and a very different outlook than his father, who was a Mandalorian foundling.
He has much more of a view of himself as a individual, a person. He has a father. He doesn't have a source code that he was born from.
He views Jango very much as his father rather than as his progenitor.
The clones, to some extent, know that they're expendable. They have no allusions to the fact that they are replicas. So that has some distinction in between their personality and Boba's as well.
Yeah, what we see, as in the early Imperial period, when the clones are still formulating the great majority of the Grand Army of the Republic, and significant spoilers incoming for the Clone Wars if you have not finished the arc about Fives. We learned that the clones were also implanted with a control chip that would allow Palpatine, for a series of specific orders, override their personalities and motivations and force them to do whatever he wanted. One of which was Order 66, which is how the clone troopers who had grown close with their Jedi commanders had grown to be trusted by them, and why the Jedi were not suspicious of them at all, because nothing in their personalities or outlook said that they would commit such an act, were able to mercilessly gun down and kill almost every Jedi in the galaxy without hesitation.
The sidebar, that final arc with Fives and just the mystery of the genetic chip that was implanted is one of the best arcs of the Clone Wars, and I feel just embarrassed if we didn't bring it up in either a discussion on the Clone Wars or our May the 4th episode where we just talked about excellent things, because that was such an intense depiction of a mysterious, intriguing event.
Yeah, and then to go back to the cloning part, there is even, I say even though, but I mean the clones are viewed by Palpatine as simply expendable copies of the same person, sort of almost like biological droids. But we know the clones as individuals with their, even in the first episode of the Clone Wars series, we have Master Plo Koon and Master Yoda each tell the clones, you are individuals to me, you matter, you have unique views in the Force, unique preferences, this makes you people.
It doesn't stop Yoda from reflexively impaling a clone trooper on his lightsaber after Order 66, though.
I mean, Yoda, the Jedi, part of not getting attached is being able to make those hard decisions. Ahsoka Tano was unable to do that, and as such was almost killed by the clone troopers that turned on her, and all of them ended up dying anyway because the ship crashed. So I think this is just a difference. And one reason Ahsoka left the Jedi was she was unable to maintain that distance and did not find it helpful, whereas Yoda and Obi-Wan are quintessential Jedi, and whether they blame the clones or not is fairly irrelevant. The clones are killing all of their friends, and so lethal force is the reaction that they choose.
Mm-hmm.
To go back to one of the previous points, so Palpatine views them as biological droids. We know that they're not. So there's this deep sense of betrayal, of like they're being robbed of their agency as people by the implantation of these control chips. It's definitely portrayed as this horrifying thing where they lose control of themselves. And as we see in the Bad Batch, the chips largely suppress the individual personalities of the clones, even after Order 66. They maintain for months the obedient, almost puppets of the Empire, carrying out orders without hesitation until the influence of this control chip starts to fade over time. And we see their individual personalities start to reassert themselves. But for a series of months, the clone troopers did function due to the control chips as almost like these mind-controlled biological droids. And even some clones still have echoes of this imprinting, brainwashing present in them, even after they've largely thrown off the control of the control chips.
I find it interesting and appealing that the fact that we have these individual personalities in the clones because it allows in like certain individuals to rise above others as characters. Like we have Captain Rex, who's one of the foremost clone characters who gets some development throughout his career, just kind of starting as the stalwart clone commander and developing more as an individual and friend to Ahsoka Tano as the show goes on.
Yeah, we get development from Commander Cody, and then we meet other specific clones such as Fives and Echo, who become ARC troopers. We get Cut LaQuain, who is a deserting clone who starts a family. We have clones that betray the Grand Army of the Republic to Ventress in the first season of the Clone Wars. So the clones are all portrayed as almost troublingly individualized, troublingly to the powers that be that created them.
And one aspect that's unique to these clones in particular is that they have a aging effect where they age
twice as fast as a normal human, so they're able to reach maturity by 10 years old. So that has a significant effect on their outlook in that they may only be 10 years old, but they have them, mental maturity of a 20-year-old, but maybe not the complex emotional context of a life I've actually lived of 20 years, which is why I think the conditioning effect was so powerful on them. And to bring this around to a discussion of cloning in general, it is very clear that the Kaminoans view them as property, in a very much chattel slavery sense. It's not subtle. They are units. They are called by the Kaminoans that created them. They are sold to the Republic for a certain amount of money.
Very much through a business lens rather than any sort of empathetic lens.
Yeah, and even in the Bad Batch, where Kamino remains one of our primary settings, even when the clones are respected, we still see them. Fives, when he is on Kamino after having flashbacks due to his chip, is seen as a defective unit, not necessarily an individual who needs help. So the focus is always on what they can do to fix him rather than help him. Mm-hmm. So it is not portrayed as a particularly attractive trait of the Kaminoans, let's say, and our more heroic Jedi characters, Ahsoka Tano, Plo Koon, Yoda, Obi-Wan to a lesser extent, admittedly, because he doesn't form attachments with many people because he's the quintessential Jedi. But they form
attachments. Anakin definitely forms attachments with his entire 501st.
Yeah, and becomes very close with the clones. And Padme, for the duration of the war, as we learn in some of the expanded universe novels, is attempting to pass a clone personhood bill. Which tells you by the fact that you're trying to pass that is that clones are not considered people and citizens under the eyes of the Republic and are instead viewed as property, kind of in the same uncomfortable way that droids are. They were created, they are being used for a purpose, but they are also thinking beings with their own preferences, thoughts, histories, emotions. We see clones fall in love, get married, they have their own bar, they call each other brother. They have the full range of human and sentient expression and experience, but to those in power, they are treated as slaves.
And in the aftermath of Order 66, when the stormtroopers are implemented, they're really just cast out. I mean, we see in Kenobi the tragic cameo by Tamora Morrison where he's the former trooper begging because he's destitute.
Yeah, we see the Bad Batch filling in this gap as well about the phasing out of clone troopers who are, while very capable, also seen of having suspect loyalty because they were bred for loyalty to the Republic, but because Jango Fett himself may have been a relatively moral person, but also because of their bonds. Okay, Jango Fett he was an individual with a personal sense of honor and standards, perhaps we'll say it that way. And that predilection towards a personal sense of honor extends to the clones for many of them. And so it expresses themselves among the Grand Army of the Republic and later the early Imperial Army as bonds with each other that they are less willing to betray than the Empire would prefer in the name of expedience, which is why they are phased out in a cheaper conscript army that could be much, much larger to hold the galaxy in an iron fist starts to be the preference, is where we have the transition from the professional and small clone army to the larger and unevenly trained but undeniably terrorizing army of the Empire, where the individual stormtroopers may at some points seem non-threatening to our main characters, but then you certainly have the elite forces that are always threatening, such as the Death Troopers used by Orson Krennic.
Yeah, I find that it's a little bit troubling that there's a greater anonymity among stormtroopers than there are amongst clone troopers, because again, clones are self-decorated. You can tell individual clones apart from their armor, and new clones are shinies because they haven't, gotten scuffs and formed their personality yet.
Yeah,
But
until Finn took off his helmet in The Force Awakens, we had never seen a stormtrooper take off their helmet. And we see that happen more often in the expanded universe, but stormtroopers are not supposed to remove their helmets. They are deliberately made to be faceless, even more so than the clones. And in fact, they have less personality than literal clones of one person, which I think is intended to say a lot in comparison to how the Empire viewed its troops.
And one of my favorite lines from Andor refers to the fact that conscripting people is cheaper than droid or clone.
It's always the solution of Empire. Throw human lives at the problem until it is solved. And
the greatest resource in the galaxy is human lives.
And even sentient lives, I suppose, in Star Wars. It's like throw the lives of anyone that can. All stormtroopers are human because of the human supremacy of the Empire. But the Empire certainly takes its toll on non-humans as well.
Sentient lives and kyber crystals. That's what the galaxy runs around.
That's what the Empire certainly needed for Death Stars and fleets. Yeah, but the clones from the Clone Wars are not the only cloning technology depicted. We have the Kaminoans didn't just clone Jango Fett; they were known to be cloners. Dexter, the information broker, reveals this to Obi-Wan. So we don't know a lot about their other cloning projects, but we know that they were able to do them. The only other cloning project that's confirmed that they worked on before Kamino was shut down by the Empire was, I say shut down, people who've seen The Bad Batch know that there was a relatively final way in which they shut down the cloning operations. But Palpatine also had them clone the Zillo Beast, that is seen in the Clone Wars, so that he could use its whatever dastardly plans he had for using an impervious being to clone by the Kaminoans. And then
never been more excited to watch a Star Wars show now because I love that Zillo Beast.
Oh yeah, watch The Bad Batch, I keep telling you.
I will.
And we also see other small scale cloning projects. We don't really see cloning outside the Kaminoans, and they do not like sharing their technology. In fact, one of the only other cloners we see, Dr. Hemlock from The Bad Batch, who is trying to understand Kaminoan cloning technology. He is less than successful. He needs to return to some of the surviving Kaminoans to help him. And it is one of the first sort of indications that the Emperor is interested in cloning technology, Palpatine, but does not trust the Kaminoans at all. They know too much, and they are too powerful. In Legends, there was even a clone rebellion where the Kaminoans cloned their own new army to fight against the Stormtroopers, which failed. That has not yet appeared in current canon, but the Kaminoans were, before they could do that, shut down by the Empire. I think the only other clones that we really see would be present in the sequel trilogy, correct?
We see, I guess, a gap in between there with The Mandalorian in terms of canon, not so much release date.
So yeah, cloning reappears timeline-wise with the character of Dr. Pershing, who appeared to have studied with the Kaminoans based on the outfit that he is wearing. And he is all in on the cloning. He's a little squeamish about having to work on live subjects, but is really excited to clone them. And as we learned from Mandalorian Season 3, Moff Gideon was attempting to have Dr. Pershing isolate the gene present for force sensitivity in Grogu to then implant into his own clones.
It leads me to ask, do we know what Grogu is?
We don't know the name of his species. We don't know that he and Yoda and Yaddle are all the same species. They have not been given a name.
For whatever reason, one of my fan theories is that Grogu is nothing but a clone of Yoda, and Yoda is the only being that has been successfully reproduced with force-sensitive genes because he is a Yoda.
That doesn't explain Yaddle.
Yaddle's not Yoda. She doesn't have the same speaking patterns. She's a Yaddle. She's not a Yoda.
We haven't heard Grogu speak either, so...
Yeah. That's just my crazy theory for the day. But regardless, the goal is for Pershing to isolate these cells so that Moff Gideon can create an army of Moff Gideons that are force sensitive. And that leads me to ask you, the Moff Gideon that we see in the Mandalorian season 3, is that Moff Gideon?
I think so, but I mean, you could definitely do deranged clone of Moff Gideon. That's sort of the MO for villains with access to cloning, is you're always talking to a clone of them. And this reminds me, actually, if we're talking about that, there is another character present in the expanded universe other than Moff Gideon who also explores cloning that we'll get to. Don't let me forget Silo,
Sure.
that attempts to betray Darth Vader. It does not go well for him. But to close out our conversation about the Moff Gideon clones, he was not intended to use this for his own purposes. Palpatine wanted him to have Pershing study the effects of cloning because Palpatine was trying to clone himself. And through he can't come back as a Force ghost because the Sith can't do that, and he had been killed, so he doesn't have like a physical body to cling to anymore. But he used dark Sith ritual to keep his conscience sort of around as a Sith apparition, as we see happen in the Darth Vader 2020 comic when he imprisons the soul or spirit essence of the Grand Inquisitor, and as we see with Darth Bane when Yoda has to confront his specter in the Clone Wars. So Palpatine manages to keep himself around in that way and needs a cloned body of himself to inhabit once again before his granddaughter's body is ready for him to inhabit as well.
And before we get to Palpatine and Snoke, well, what about the Silo?
So this is another character that we see, I believe, likely related to Dr. Pershing, someone who studied cloning with the Kaminoans. He was a big believer in the supremacy of biological sciences over the Force. So he uses techno augmentation on people's bodies to have them mimic the abilities of Jedi without them actually having access to the Force, which Darth Vader finds rather sacrilegious. Palpatine tolerates it because he finds it amusing, and hey, if anyone challenges Darth Vader, he'll either replace him or make him more powerful. But Darth Vader kills Silo several times, but Silo has clones of himself just in pods, so a new one awakens. We're on Silo 4 by the time we get to the end of it, when Darth Vader invades his... Silo has made his base inside a Purgle, which is one of those space whales. So he's literally carved his base into the living body of one with its brain in a jar.
Okay.
Because Silo's a great person. And when Darth Vader then slaughters all the Silo clones to the last one, and then he is trapped on the ship, but then he can't do a Jedi mind trick on Silo because Silo's bred resistance to himself in that through his cloning eugenics. So instead he Jedi mind tricks the space whale into flying into a sun. Or Force dominant, really, since he's a Sith, and then flies off in his TIE fighter while Silo's cloning lab aboard his space whale is consumed. So Palpatine had plans within plans if he was overthrown. The Death Star was supposed to stop him from being overthrown. If that failed, he had Operation Cinder, intended to distract everyone from the fact that he had other plans, while he retreated to his fleet that he was slowly building out in wild space, where he'd established a base with the help of Grand Admiral Thrawn, to the unknown regions, to then have... But I think that the cloning was obviously not complete, because the cloned Palpatine that exists in The Rise of Skywalker is more deranged and much less calculating than the Palpatine Prime, let's say.
He's also physically uncooked. I believe he's about half a Palpatine. His fingers aren't complete, and I originally thought, did he burn his fingers off somehow? And it's like, nah, because he has human Palpatine face with blind eyes, and I believe he's probably really just blind. Awful looking hands, and you don't see his lower body at all. So I think he's this husk of a somewhat force sensitive. Is he? Oh yeah, he's force sensitive.
He still has his full powers in the Force. That's I think that's the reason that clone body was the most successful. It was the one they successfully managed to bring his Force sensitivity back. He's able to unleash the full might of his Force lightning upon the Resistance fleet.
So we have this clone Palpatine husk who is this mastermind behind the First Order, and his figurehead is Snoke. And I have yet another crazy fan theory.
I don't think it's crazy. I think Snoke is certainly a failed clone of Palpatine. This is further reinforced by the comic, The Rise of Kylo Ren, where the clone of Palpatine that is present in the unknown region senses when Ben Solo falls to the dark side. We even see a cutaway to him, and where he's also in communication with Snoke as well.
I definitely lean into, yes, he is this. Whether he knows that he's Palpatine or not, he's being puppeteered by Palpatine. But for some reason, I think just based on some fan art I saw, because there aren't enough Palpatine cells, I'm going back to DC Comics where Superboy is a clone of Superman, but there's a small percentage of like Kryptonian DNA that can't be replicated, so they replace it with Lex Luthor's of all people. So he is 99% Superman, 1% Lex Luthor. I think that Snoke could be mostly Palpatine with anyone else mixed in to make him a complete person. For whatever reason, Tarkin came to mind, just because of presence, because of the more military focus of the First Order, and maybe just to separate him from Palpatine so that Snoke can be his own strange creature. Tangent ended.
So I think Snoke is certainly portrayed as probably being a clone, particularly with the montage that we start with to see the based on Exegol in The Rise of Skywalker.
Mm-hmm.
So this is sort of the fusion of like cloning technology, which is already viewed as sort of ethically problematic. Even if we like the clones themselves, the method of their creation and the control of them has moral quandaries involved. And then Palpatine is just wholeheartedly like, yeah, I'm going to use cloning to survive beyond death, which he does in the Legends as well. So this is playing in that same space, though he doesn't get a hot young body. He gets as all clones were hot young bodies in the 90s. So instead, this is old, decrepit, partially complete clone, which is why he's going the classic evil wizard approach of hopping into a relative's body with a body snatcher style.
Before then sucking the essence of a Force dyad to not only rebuild himself into a full form, but also transform his face into a Sith mask, which might be his true face.
Yeah, so Palpatine is basically Cell from Dragon Ball Z,
Yes.
in Rise of Skywalker, which is why Rise of Skywalker had great ideas, execution left somewhat to be desired. Because that concept is interesting. Mm-hmm. He just didn't know enough about his motivations through the previous two movies for that to really make much sense. But it happened. There was crazed clone Palpatine in the background, just trying to... And he's insane. He's doing the same thing he tried when he conquered the galaxy 30 years ago. I'll get some super weapons together, some starships. I'll get a dangerous apprentice. I'll get super powerful on the dark side, and I'll rule again.
I need a Skywalker. I need starships, and
I need a Solo.
I need a Death Star.
Yeah. And except for Death Star, I'm gonna have a. I'm gonna crowdsource my Death Star with this with the Final Order. So. Yeah, so I think we don't see a lot of other cloning present in Star Wars. We see, so we grapple with are clones people? I think you and I lean on the side of yes, and I think we're intended to view them as people, and then view the power structure that deny them personhood with suspicion and dread. But you're also supposed to see the science of cloning itself as something that's ethically problematic. It has been outlawed by the New Republic as of the Mandalorian Season 3. So understood conceptually, and maybe perhaps being explored for the cloning of organs, but the cloning of whole sentient people has been outlawed. And we don't see any person wanting to engage in cloning other than Dr. Pershing, and Silo, and Palpatine, and the Kaminoans.
And Palpatine ultimately manipulates it to its worst possible end by not creating himself like his one clone, who's his son, the father of Rey, is his own person. It's the natural path for clones to be not duplicates, and he's manipulating that to create himself a self that he can possess.
Yeah. So I get the sense that the body he's inhabiting by the time he might have even had its own personality, but he subsumed that personality and is going to try to do the same to Rey. Mm-hmm. So I think the intersection of cloning and the dark side is problematic. Clones are certainly people, but I think Star Wars is coming down the side of what are the ethics of creating life in an unnatural way, and accepting the life that exists, but maybe thinking twice before engaging in cloning yourself.
And in the end, I think that George Lucas teed off a great adaptation of what a clone could be at so many different angles. So much better than what anyone did in Legends, because the only time that a clone came up in Legends, it was embarrassing. So the biggest example is when in Heir to the Empire, the crazy clone Jedi Joris Kabayath takes Luke Skywalker's hand and creates a clone out of it called Luke Skywalker with two U's. So this is another thing that George Lucas has done well, rather than those who have followed in his footsteps.
Yeah. So could crazed clone Palpatine have required more foreshadowing to be truly compelling? Yes. But can we accept that there is still being built a through thread of his obsession with cloning, to use cloning to unnaturally extend his life? Yes.
Absolutely.
And did he do it through dark Sith magic and science? Yes. Was it a bad idea? Yes. Did it result in his downfall? Yes. And but are the clone troopers that survive the Clone Wars also interesting and fully realized characters deserving of personhood? Also, yes.
I wouldn't mind seeing more featured in future media. I'm excited to see the Bad Batch, and I hope some are featured in the Ahsoka show.
Yeah, and I think Star Wars in the future could continue to grapple with cloning, because either in an alien or non-alien context, like we see in The Mandalorian, we see a species of aquatic people with eggs that are almost extinct. It's like, would cloning help them revitalize their species? Are there species that only reproduce by cloning? Does it become a more common practice? Does it not? Is in a post-New Republic era, people pick up these forbidden sciences again? And can you hold back the tide of science with simply laws and regulation? I think there's lots more that Star Wars could explore with cloning, because currently cloning's either been by a secret Sith cabal or by the most powerful government in the galaxy. There's also, I think, other areas of cloned organs, cloned individuals. In the same way that droids are interesting, clones could continue to be interesting.
Yeah, featured in some niche ways, some niche, unique cultural ways. That'd be interesting to see.
Right. Well, that is our take on cloning. If we missed any clones that you would like us to talk about, or have any thoughts on our take on cloning in Star Wars, drop us a comment, and we look forward to talking to you next week with more Star Wars.
Until then.